Thank you for joining us today for our annual legislative recap, where we're going to share what happened for Maine's environment in the 2024 legislative session. My name is Kristen Jackson. I am the digital strategist for the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and I'll be your host for the next hour. I first want to acknowledge that all of the work that NRCM does is conducted on the unceded territory of the Wabanaki people, who have stewarded these lands since long before colonial settlers forcibly occupied the area. We acknowledge and recognize tribal sovereignty, and you'll hear an update later in the webinar from Josh on progress made for the state of Maine to recognize tribal sovereignty this session. We know how important it is to work together with the Wabanaki across all of our issues to protect the land, air, water, and wildlife of this place that we call Maine. Today, I am joined by our staff experts and some guest speakers who will share what we accomplished together this legislative session that will protect Maine's climate, wildlife, water, and outdoors. I know a lot of you are familiar with NRCM. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list, but if we have any new folks here in the audience, NRCM is Maine's largest environmental advocacy organization. And we harness the power of science, the law, and the voices of people like yourselves to protect the nature of Maine. And so you'll hear today a lot about how the voices of individuals can make a difference in Maine's legislature and for Maine's environment. But I'm going to start with just two statistics that I wanted to share. So this session, which started back in January and ended in the middle of April, NRCM supporters sent nearly 3,000 messages to legislators on the bills that we worked on, and every single legislator got at least one message from an NRCM supporter about one of these issues that we were working on together. So when we're going through these different issues throughout this next hour, just know that none of the victories that we mentioned would have been possible without the support of people like you who are joining us today. So thank you. Before we dive in and hear from our speakers, I want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. So the first is that this event is currently being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel if you'd like to review anything covered or share it with friends, and we'll send out an email tomorrow with that recording. And then if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can find a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Please type and put them in there. We also obviously have the chat active. Thanks for folks who are introducing yourselves. You can put questions in there, but just sometimes they get a little buried. So I recommend the Q&A box so you can keep track of them and get back to you if you need to. That's all from me. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pete Biddesheim, our Senior Director of Advocacy, to give us an overview of the session.
Hello, everybody. I'm Pete Biddesheim. I'm the Advocacy Director here at NRCM, and I have been here for 28 years. So this was my 28th time around the track at the State House. And it's always exciting for us to give this presentation. It's been an exhilarating, challenging, sometimes stressful, sometimes chaotic legislative session. But the thrill really is shared by all of us now that it is over and we can talk about what was accomplished. So let me just start by saying what we already all know, which is that a lot of really important decisions are made under the State House dome throughout the session, good decisions, bad decisions, everything in between. And they're made by 151 representatives, 35 senators, with a lot of input and nagging from the governor, her administration, from lobbyists, from NRCM staff, and from the 3,000 people that Kristen just mentioned that contacted them. So many people are trying to influence the outcome at the State House. So there's lots of pushing and pulling, and there's some really unpredictable hair-raising moments that always happen. And our job is to be there at the State House, building relationships, sharing information to help achieve the best possible outcome on dozens of bills. We testified on 60 different bills during the 131st legislature. So we stay really focused on lawmakers directly, and quick shout out to our outreach and communication staff who are communicating with our supporters, the public, through the media, bank shots of various sorts to try to influence the thinking and the outcome on key votes. And it all does seem to work because we consistently have a positive impact. And this year was no exception. That's the good news that we will share during today's presentation. We do have some victories to talk about. And by we, as Kristen said, I'm talking about the capital we. Ourselves, our coalition partners, some incredible legislative champions, key staff in the administration, and so many supporters across the state who are trying to influence the outcome of decisions under the dome. So let's move to the next slide. So that said, this was a difficult session. All legislative sessions are difficult. It's really hard to get something significant accomplished at the State House. This year is an election year, a presidential election year, that makes things more partisan. There were a number of hot button issues that made things pretty tense at times, including gun safety, abortion, training camps for paramilitary groups, and many other issues. Also, the supplemental budget got very messy near the end, causing divisions and rancor within the parties, between the chambers, between the legislature and the administration, right up until 5:30 a.m. on April 18th, when the bickering and the legislating pretty much came to a stop. That's when they adjourned. That's when our opportunity to influence the outcome pretty much came to an end, when our work, all the work, are in committees, work sessions, legislative briefings, lobbying in the hallways, and the final votes ceased. Pretty much, they are going to come back on Friday, May 10th for veto day, and there might be some additional decisions made about the allocation of some funds that are left on the appropriations table. But the process is pretty much over, and that's what we want to talk about. So we do have 3 of my colleagues, and we have a couple of partners who are going to share the news on bills that they were working with. And I'm going to hand it off to Vanessa Berry first, who can introduce herself, and her partner, who will be helping share the good news from her work at the State House. All yours, Vanessa.
Perfect. Thanks, Pete. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Berry, and I'm the Sustainable Maine Program Manager for the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Within the Sustainable Maine program, we focus largely on solutions for more sustainable management of our natural resources through effective state and local waste prevention initiatives. Mainers have a strong core value of not wasting things and living by the old adage of use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. But we know it's only getting more difficult for everyday people to avoid making waste, especially when it comes to packaging and plastics. We can go to the next slide, Kristen. Since 1989, our state has had a goal of recycling and diverting about 50% or more of our waste, but we've never actually been able to achieve that goal, despite our best efforts to recycle and compost. In the latest reports from the Department of Environmental Protection, we're actually seeing that Maine is generating more waste per capita, while recycling rates have remained stagnant. This is because of growing challenges of managing waste in Maine, but our team at NRCM has been really focused on prioritizing opportunities that prevent waste at the source by following Maine's waste hierarchy, which is the image to the right of this slide here. It starts with source reduction, reuse of items, and then follows up with recycling and composting of materials before we dispose of them. This year, in an effort to support more solutions that focus on the reuse of items, so moving things up that waste hierarchy, NRCM and our coalition of reuse partners teamed up to support LD 2091, which is an act regarding businesses and consumers' use of returnable, reusable, and refillable containers for food, beverage, and non-food items. And to discuss this further, I'm so pleased to introduce Kate Pelot, who's the owner of Farm and Fish, which is a locally sourced and responsibly packaged meal kit service that's located in Castine. Kate's business was the inspiration for LD 2091, and she played a vital role in the success of this legislation. So at this time, I'd love to turn it over to Kate to talk about the bill and kind of share her success story.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you, NRCM, for having me, and thank you to the audience for your attention and patience. Yeah, so I have no background in legislation or activism. My background is in mechanical engineering and project management, and kind of in working in the nonprofit sector. And so when I decided to start a new chapter and start Farm and Fish late in 2022, that my business model was about providing the convenience and fun of a meal kit. I had been a subscriber from the national brands and really appreciated the ready to make meal. I still like cooking. It just, I didn't have the bandwidth for the sourcing part. And so I really loved the experience, but I was really frustrated because I didn't always know, I rarely knew where the ingredients came from. And there was just a ton of plastic packaging that really weighed on my conscience and really weighed on my trash bags. And you can, there's this opacity to plastics and what's recyclable and what is not recyclable. And there was an added level of guilt if I was putting something in the recycling bin that wasn't recyclable or vice versa. And then even if something is recyclable, where does it go? Is it just kind of off to the perk plant anyway? Is it, we heard about how we used to export our recycling and that doesn't happen anymore. So where's it going? And so just some opacity for people who didn't have the bandwidth like me to kind of do the research and follow the trash and really understand what was going on. So when I started this business model, it was really about the convenience and fun of a meal kit, but sourcing from Maine producers first, and then using reusable packaging so that we didn't even have to worry about where is this packaging going to end up. And that was complete naivete on my part. It didn't occur to me that that wasn't allowed. And so in the process of getting my food license, the health inspector was like, you want to what? That's not an option, lady. And so really was surprised to hear that and frustrated. In terms of the business model, I pretty quickly pivoted to some compostable packaging. And you can see a little bit in that picture with the idea of using fiber-based compostable first. And that was another exploration on compostable packaging, because just because something says it's compostable doesn't mean it's compostable in your area. So we have a commercial composter in Blue Hill, great chickadee compost, but they're not the high heat facility that can handle corn-based PLA. So any of those plastic-like containers were off the table for me because I didn't want to offer responsible packaging to customers if it was just going to end up in the garbage anyway. So fiber-based where we can, and then we do use plastic where we have to, because at least that's recyclable supposedly. So so that's kind of our packaging model now. But in parallel, I had reached out. I was doing a little bit of looking to see how the timeline worked out. I had reached out to local representation in the Blue Hill area, Nina Milliken and Nicole Grahowski, in June of 2023 to say, well, I just learned that I can't do this reusable thing, and that doesn't really pass any sort of sanity check for me. And I'd love to know what the options are. And so that was in June, and didn't really hear much back. And really kind of was working primarily with Nicole Grahowski, Senator Grahowski, until I happened to run into her in Ellsworth one day and introduced myself and said, I'm the lady that's bugging you about packaging. And she said, thank you for introducing yourself. I made progress. I just haven't had time to actually turn around and tell you about the progress I've made, but it's up for initial approval. And we have some votes, but we don't have all the votes we need. And so we were able to rally additional support for the people on that small approval committee. And that was that initial push and approval happened in November of 2023. And then I think that's around the time I was introduced to NRCM and some of the other supporters that Senator Grahowski already knew of and had brought into this conversation. The bill, it became a bill, and there was a public hearing in January of 2024. We're in 2024, yeah, we are. And then it was ultimately signed by the governor in early March. And so for me, it was a really positive and optimistic experience in terms of this constituent and small business owner has a problem and is raising her hand about it. Somebody was willing to hear that concern, and it did not fall on deaf ears. I think you hear a lot of tropes about government falling on deaf ears, and that was not my experience at all. And it worked its way through the process, and it was a really rewarding experience. And now I'm terrified because I actually have to walk my walk now. And so as soon as it's formally enacted, which I believe is 90 days from when the legislature adjourns, then the plan is to move forward with a subscription model for customers where they can get a kit or kits every week. And when I'm dropping off their kit this week, I'm picking up their packaging from last week, taking it back to the commercial kitchen, sanitizing it, and moving forward. And I actually already have the containers in before I realized it wasn't an option, I bought some stainless steel containers in a couple different sizes, and small glass, 2 4-ounce jars for the liquids and the spices and the smaller quantities. So that's my story. That's my experience. And I hope it introduces a little optimism into your day. I think that's probably hard to come by sometimes. And it worked well, and the support was unbelievable.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. Do you want to go to the next slide, Kristen? I can just touch on a little bit of kind of what's coming next with reuse, because obviously this piece of legislation opens up a lot of doors for continued work in this space. Reuse is a powerful tool that saves businesses money with a one-time purchase over disposable packaging. It saves municipal tax dollars on disposal, prevents waste, which is obviously a really good goal of ours, but it's also a better customer experience. And so we're kind of trying to spread the good word about reuse. We've got coalitions building in Portland, and they're hoping to do some more piloting with reuse. So we'll be exploring a lot through the passage of this bill. And also there's some really good alignment with this work and the EPR for packaging law that's coming to help encourage producers to explore reusable containers. So we're really excited about what this is going to do for Maine and reducing our waste footprint in the state. And reuse is also a common conversation within the Maine Climate Council through the Materials Management Task Force about how we can better facilitate reusable systems in the state. And we're really excited to see where that takes us. So go reuse and continue to reduce, reuse, and refill all of your containers. And I'll turn it over to Pete to talk about Trails Bond.
Okay, so the Trails Bond actually has some comparisons to Kate's story. About a year and a half ago, NRCM staff and board were in Farmington, and we were having conversations with a number of people in that area, and one conversation with Brent West, of Executive Director of High Peaks Alliance. It was his idea that we really should support a bond or some sort of funding for trails. So from that idea, we drafted a bill, and for the last year and a half, we've been building a statewide coalition in support of a $30 million trails bond, which is on its way to the November ballot. So everybody in the state of Maine who's a registered voter will have a chance to vote on this. And we're super excited about it because we defied the odds of getting a bond, which requires a 2/3 vote through the House and Senate in order to get it on the ballot. A lot of people along the way said that that was not going to be possible, but we were able to do it. And let me just mention a few ways that that happened. Next slide. So we really elevated the level of public awareness about the difficult situation that many of our trails are in. They've received record use since the pandemic. The extreme weather events have really worn down a lot of trails. We also have many communities that are interested in building more accessible trails for people with all ability and age levels. And we've really upped people's awareness that the state of Maine has incredible trails, but we invest almost nothing in our trails. Essentially, no money has been provided by the state of Maine, by the people of Maine, into their trails. We really depend on volunteers and nonprofits to do all the heavy lifting, literally, to keep our trails in good shape. And most of our trails are not in great shape. They need investment. It's a type of infrastructure like roads that needs investment. Next slide. And through that investment, we also get significant economic returns. Trails are a key part of our $3.3 billion outdoor recreation economy that employs about 31,000 people. Snowmobiling alone is estimated to be more than a $600 million annual contribution to Maine's economy. And the total economic activity associated with our trails is probably more than $1 billion, well over $1 billion annually. But it's not just about the economic benefits, it's about the public health benefits. It's about connecting to nature. It's about building relationships with the natural world, which then translate into an interest in protecting the natural world. Next slide. So we built one of the biggest, broadest coalitions that we've ever worked on with NRCM. We ended up getting 520 businesses, organizations, and towns to sign a sign-on letter to the legislature, urging them to pass the Trails Bond on to the voters of Maine so we can be the deciders of it. And this coalition includes all these little dots on the map. Those are locations where 75 cities and towns, 168 businesses, 41 ATV and snowmobile clubs, 43 statewide organizations, 193 local organizations, the State Chamber of Commerce, LL Bean, Maine Municipal Association, Bicycle Coalition of Maine, New England Mountain Bike Association, Maine Tourism Association, Maine Outdoor Brands. We built a really big coalition, mobilized these different supporters of the Trails Bond to contact their legislators, and we really focused a lot of our attention in rural Maine and got a lot of people excited about the possibility of actually investing in our trails, improving the trails that we have, building new trails, and helping Maine become one of the top tier states in the nation that's known for outstanding trails. So we hope that the funding that will be provided through this bond, which we anticipate will be supported by the voters of Maine. There was a poll that was done in 2019 suggesting that more than 70% of Maine voters would support a trails bond. So now I want to pass this on to Steve Kasachek, who is a key partner with us in this effort. And Steve is actually in the field working on a trail and can give us a window into the world that he sees that will benefit from this trails bond, if it passes.
Awesome. Thank you, Pete. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. I am sitting here in the Rockland Bog on a kind of a wet day. So hope everyone's enjoying their dry office. This is the not so fun part of trail work, cold and wet and bugs. My name's Steve Kasachek. I work for the Outdoor Sport Institute. We're a nonprofit physically based up in Millinocket. That does a wide range of stuff around outdoor sport. And obviously, I think my role there is around trail development, which I've been doing for almost a decade now. Previously, I worked for the International Mountain Bicycling Association's Trail Solutions program, which allowed me to travel all over the country, working on really high quality destination, awesome community level projects, all sorts of trails, not just mountain biking, hiking, equestrian, some motorized, some snow trails. So I got to see a lot of cool places and a lot of communities. And I really chose for the next part of my career to come here and make a home in Maine and raise a family for a lot of reasons around what I see around the opportunities with trails. You know, as you heard, Maine, all of New England, the Northeast has a lot of legacy trails, as we'd call them, a lot of historical or social trails that weren't necessarily developed for the level of use we're seeing today or the trends we see in modern recreation. And we're just recognizing how trails are they're a very low cost investment that has a really high return for things like health and wellness and social connections, conservation values, increasing property values of homes. People love living within hiking, walking or biking distance of trails. So there's these immense benefits that they bring to individuals and communities, and we're seeing that all over the country. People are investing in trails, and so it's awesome. I'm a part of the Maine Trails Coalition, and we decided, it's about time to do that here in Maine. And NRCM has been really vital in getting us to where we are now. Showing up to the State House was much different than my normal office, as you can tell. So what are the opportunities I see? I do a lot of planning and design in my role as director of trail infrastructure here at OSI. And so I get to travel to all sorts of communities. We've been doing a ton of work up in the Millinocket, up in the Katahdin region. I've been up there since my last job with IMBA. But I've worked last year all the way from Madawaska to Rumford to Camden, Monson. Obviously, I'm in Rockland right now. Earlier this year, I was in Casco. There's a lot of people very interested in trails. There's a lot of opportunities. We're obviously the largest state in New England, and we have a lot of open space, a lot of privately owned open space, but we have a rich history of being able to utilize that for various recreation. So there's a lot going on out there. I think I've estimated that I've planned over 500 miles of trail in my time, which is an astronomical number that I'll never see built. And what are the limits? Well, the limits are, on fixing all the hundreds of miles of trails we have, or creating, implementing all these other hundreds of miles of trails. Our big limits are our capacity as a state. We don't have a ton of people doing this work. It's become more and more specialized. I just attended the Professional Trail Builders Association conference where we actually got to speak on our work here in Maine, which was very exciting. But there's a whole professional industry around this. And you see a lot of contractors developing in other parts of the country. And thankfully, we do have some great contractors here in the state, but even they could not tackle everything that we need to get done or we want to get done. And so, interestingly, I spend a lot of my role also in education. In the Katahdin region, OSI has a trail crew, mostly made up of college and high school age kids, and we've got a ton of work for them. But we just can't hire them. We need more people. There's not enough people. It's obviously very rural up there, and we're hiring as many as we can, but we're always looking for more. And we need that funding to make these projects happen so that we can hire more people, so that we can interest people who are maybe in the industry to, hey, come to this state and see what we have to offer, see the awesome quality of life. People who want to settle down and raise a family or be a part of a community. This is a great place to do it, and they can make a living working and maintaining our trails. And so to me, really, that I think is the biggest opportunity of the Trails Bond, is this opportunity for the state to put a lot of people who are already looking for jobs in this state to work and to attract new workers to the state, and new people to the state around the quality of life. But I really think the Trails Bond can put a lot of Mainers to work, especially young people. It's a great summer job. This is our trail crew in the picture there. That was a buggy day as well, but they always have fun. I think there's a huge opportunity in this state to be a leader in the education of trails. We're seeing that more and more at the higher ed level in high schools. OSI is working with some partners on that type of work, but a Trails Bond is going to help unlock even more of that. And we can be seen as a real leader in trails. I think we have some of the most remarkable opportunities in the country. We've got mountains, we've got a very rugged coastline, we've got very wild open spaces, we've got amazing communities with beautiful little downtowns, and all of this can benefit from trails, and trails are a really great way to, as I said earlier, offer a lot of benefits to our communities. So really excited to be a part of the Trails Bond effort and happy to be here. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Steve. I think now we're turning it over to Jack Shapiro, NRCM's Climate and Clean Energy Director.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Man, I'm all fired up about trails and reusable stuff, but I got to get back to my own stuff and offshore wind. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Jack Shapiro. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director at NRCM, and I'm here to talk about LD 2266. Which is a really important bill to enable offshore wind development in Maine. This was a surprise bill. It didn't come until about a month or so before the end of the session. Usually we have a lot more heads up. But I think it's just another example of some of the work that we do, and we really appreciate all of your support in doing. Sometimes we have surprises, and it's really important that we're there at the State House to make sure that we get good outcomes on these bills for some of our critical environmental and climate priorities. You can go to the next slide, Kristen. Thanks. So just some quick background, stepping back on offshore wind. As a environmental group that's been doing this work in Maine for more than half a century, we have reached the conclusion, as climate change has started to really impact our state, that all of the work that we do to protect our woods and waters, our wildlife, and our coasts, we really can't do that work meaningfully if we don't address climate change, one of the biggest threats to all of those natural resources. And part of our strategy in doing that in Maine, as is happening around the country and around the world, is through clean energy and electrification. So moving the uses that the places where we currently use fossil fuels towards electrified end uses, and getting all of that power from clean energy. And offshore wind is going to be a really important part of that mix for Maine. It's expected that offshore wind will generate about half of the clean energy that we need by 2040, including fueling electric vehicles, heat pumps, as well as replacing fossil fuels for power generation. But offshore wind is also a once-in-a-century economic opportunity for our state. The Gulf of Maine is deep. It's going to require floating anchored offshore wind turbines, which is different from elsewhere in the country, giving us an opportunity to lead and bring thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, careers for young people who'll be able to stay in the state, working on the climate and clean energy transition. So really a huge potential benefit. Next slide. And this effort is moving ahead, and this is why LD 2266 was really important to pass this session. We just heard this week the federal government is going to be offering offshore wind leases in these 8 offshore wind leases for sale later this year. That's been the plan for a couple of years now, but it's moving forward on schedule. You'll sort of note there are in that sort of green Dr. Seuss character shaped shape there. There are sort of 2 green areas up in the northern part near Maine. We had a big success last legislative session, LD 1895, Maine's landmark offshore wind procurement bill. And without that, we may not have seen leases offered for sale up near Maine. So this is a really good validation of some of that work as well. The state also is requesting input for how they will procure offshore wind energy, sort of ask for developers to give Maine bids to sell offshore wind energy, and what kinds of standards we'll want to set for them for equity, for investment in Maine, for investments in fishing communities, for labor standards, and things like that. So really important that we keep all of the other pieces of this moving along as well, including a port. Kristen, next slide. So without a port to construct these floating offshore wind turbines, offshore wind will basically not happen in the Gulf of Maine in the time that we need it to help us address climate change. There are no other ports dedicated to floating offshore wind that are in consideration elsewhere on the East Coast, and ports are a huge need generally. The studies show we'll need about 100 port facilities around the country to fully develop offshore wind, and right now there's only about 35 that are under development. The port is also where nearly all of the economic benefits come through. Constructing these turbines is where all of the jobs are at. Supply chain businesses will not be placed in Maine if they're not near a construction facility. So it's a hugely important and significant element of this overall effort. So LD 2266, with all that background said, came about because the state has been considering two sites for an offshore wind port, both in Searsport, one at Mack Point, an existing port facility, and one at Sears Island just across the channel. The state had put forward Sears Island as the preferred alternative, and the reason this bill broke late is because it was discovered that a protected sand dune existed in the proposed site. Now, Maine has really strong sand dune protections. If you disturb a sand dune with your development cannot be permitted. So what our approach to this was, we wanted to make sure that both of these sites, because the stakes are so high for this port, that both of these sites were still able to be considered. So along with a number of our environmental allies and folks in organized labor, we worked on an amendment that ensured that this bill was extremely narrow, to only be really talking about this one dune, and saying once every other permitting requirement is fulfilled, then and only then could this exemption be granted for this specific purpose. We also added a provision that another sand dune on the island would be permanently protected, and the bill created $1 million sand dune restoration fund, a fund that we did not previously have in Maine, and really would have been an enormous environmental win had it been its own standalone bill. Made sure that that was included as well. So this is, part of the sort of difficult conversations that we are having as an environmental community around ensuring that we are building the clean energy infrastructure and generation resources that we need to address climate change, but trying to do it in a way that avoids or minimizes the direct impacts of some of that development as they go. And that's something we're going to continue to be attentive to on offshore wind, in constructing the port, in constructing the projects themselves far out in the Gulf of Maine and federal waters, and in constructing sort of the transmission and interconnection assets that'll be needed as well. So next slide, Kristen. So there were a few other clean energy bills. Well, there were a whole bunch of other clean energy bills, but just mentioning a couple of other ones here. One other good thing that went through this session was some additional funding for Maine's Community Resilience Partnership. This was has been a really great approach that the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future has put forward, where participating communities who have community stakeholder conversations and develop a local climate action plan can be eligible for state funding. Also sets folks in great positions for some of these big waves of federal funding under the infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden has signed. We had a gas reform bill looking at the operation of Maine's natural gas distribution system, and ways that we can think about whether or not it is appropriate to expand that system and what some of the impacts of that are. And a pilot bill for medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. Those vehicles create disproportionate amounts of both climate and other air pollution. And so electrifying the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector is a big priority. So glad to see that all of those moving forward as well. There are a lot of other bills that we worked on as well, on transmission and other things, but that's all the time we have. So I'll stop there and I will pass it back to Kristen.
Thanks, Jack. And if you want a deeper dive on some of the climate and clean energy stuff we worked on this past legislative session, tomorrow at noon, we have our monthly climate action call, and I'll drop that link in the chat if folks are interested in signing up. In the meantime, I'll pass it over to Josh to talk about tribal sovereignty.
Thanks, Kristen. And yeah, please tune in tomorrow. It's going to be a blast. But for now, I'm going to be telling you a bit about our engagement on tribal sovereignty legislation this year, and specifically on LD 2007, which is the third bill since 2019 that has been presented to restore self-determination for the tribes in Maine and to call for state recognition of tribal sovereignty. As you may know, if you've been keeping up with our work and the work of the Wabanaki Alliance, the 4 tribes in Maine are the only 4 federally recognized tribes in the country, and there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the country. The ones in Maine are the only ones that are not recognized as sovereign nations, but rather operate similar to municipalities in that the state of Maine has jurisdiction over tribal land. We can go to the next slide, Kristen. So LD 2007, as originally proposed, included the 22 recommendations that came out of a bipartisan task force. They produced a report in 2019 outlining the ways in which the 1980 Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act should be amended to put the tribes in Maine on equal footing with other tribes nationwide. This would enable the tribes to steward their lands as they have done for time immemorial and have access to federal grants and programs that are available to all other tribal nations, but that have been gatekept by the state from the tribes in Maine. There are 181 federal tribes or federal benefits programs since 1980 that the tribes in Maine have not had access to. The organizing challenge on this bill was that a governor's veto was anticipated. So we were seeking to get a 2/3 majority in the House and Senate to override any veto threat. Unfortunately, the math did not work out this session with some of the partisan tensions that Pete had referenced earlier. So the Wabanaki Alliance, which is the leading advocacy coalition representing tribal interests, chose to move forward with a narrowed version of the bill that still makes some important changes. So we can head to the next slide, Kristen. So Governor Mills did sign a narrowed version of LD 2007 into law, which provides the tribes in Maine with criminal jurisdiction over their lands and includes clean drinking water provisions for the Penobscot Nation. While this is not a full victory and only pertains to a few of the recommendations presented in that bipartisan report I referenced, this is the first time that the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act has been substantively amended. And it is an important step forward for the tribes in Maine and their allies. I also just want to highlight that the coalition in support of state recognition of tribal sovereignty continued to grow by leaps and bounds this year. We now have over 270 businesses and organizations that are members of the Wabanaki Alliance, including the Natural Resources Council of Maine. And this year we were one of over 620 organizations and people to provide testimony in support of LD 2007, which is really an astounding statement of support from Mainers all across the state. The final thing I'll note here is that a bill was passed as well to establish an Office of Tribal State Affairs, which will provide a more formalized avenue for communication between the state of Maine and the tribes in Maine going forward. So efforts for tribal sovereignty will continue. We're not quite there yet. And I would encourage each of you to check out the Wabanaki Alliance to learn more about how you can contribute to this ongoing justice work. And I'll pass it back to Kristen again.
Thanks so much, Josh. We're going to go back to Pete just for a few other notes on things that happened this session. I see some questions coming in. Feel free to keep putting those in there and we'll get to Q&A in just a minute.
Very quickly, we want to get to Q&A in just a minute. So just a few other bills that I just want to mention. The appropriations bill did include creation of a new Office of Community Affairs. It's somewhat analogous to the state planning office that was abolished and dismantled during the LePage administration. It pulls together the climate resilience programs, the Community Resilience Partnership in particular. The Maine Coastal Program is going to be included, municipal planning, land use planning, also housing planning all together in a new office, which is a great thing. There was a bill that passed that provides municipalities with some additional enforcement authority for the shoreline zoning law, which is really important for lake water quality. We defeated a bill that would have opened up Maine's coastline to industrial rockweed harvesting. We are pleased that that bill was withdrawn before it even went to a hearing. There was another bill, a perennial bill to weaken our solar policies, our net energy billing policy. That was another bad bill that we defeated. And there was also a bill from the nuclear power industry that was basically a public relations bill. They wanted to put Maine on the map as a state that they could then assert to financial markets was actively interested in reviving the nuclear power sector, but that was tabled and never removed from the table, which is good in the House. And then there's some bills that are undecided and or unfunded. There's a possibility that some of these might get funding when the Appropriations Committee meets and when additional decisions are made about remaining money that's available in the budget, dealing with the Climate Corps, possibly the Forest Advisory Board, the Outdoor School for All. There's lots of bills that are competing for a small amount of money, and Most, if not all of those bills probably will die and will be unfunded. So when I pass, oh, one more slide. Yes, we will be back again after the November elections for more of this fun and excitement involving you in passing next year's positive bills, we hope. So just stay tuned, and now we can move on to questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete. I'm going to take the slides down so we can see each other. Let's see. Feel free to keep putting your questions in the Q&A box. I see there's one that Kate already answered via typing, but I think it's a great one to ask out loud. It came from Pat for Kate and Vanessa. Thanking you both for your leadership on this reuse bill, and then asking if we've heard of any other businesses following in Kate's footsteps, and if anyone is available to provide other businesses with guidance on how to scale up reusables.
You want to start, Kate, and then I can follow up?
Yeah, I think my answer is a little light at the time. So I've heard enthusiasm both from really small businesses, even just here in Castine, that they're saying we want to jump on this. We want to offer beverages in reusable containers, and we don't really know how to do this yet, but we're willing to try to figure it out. And then Clink, which is the company that accepts returnables at grocery stores and other locations, they testified on behalf of the bill in support of. And so I don't really know what they have in mind in terms of business opportunity, but there's got to be something. So I think that's encouraging. And then even from outside the state, we just were contacted by a woman in Michigan who is trying to get the Michigan food code updated to accommodate reusables, and had seen the Maine bill and was kind of looking for our experience, looking for our story and our experience on that to help inform how she should proceed. So I really want Farm and Fish and these other businesses to fail forward in this and figure it out, because we don't know how to do this. It's not been done in a long time, right? Milk bottles used to be reused, but it hasn't been done in recent history. And so trying to figure all that out is next steps, and hoping as we kind of prove the process that more and more companies will say, oh, we can do that, and jump on board.
Yeah, and I can just follow up by saying there are a couple of groups, two kind of working simultaneously throughout the state that are kind of specifically directed towards reuse infrastructure and just increasing participation in reuse systems across the state. The first one is the University of Maine's Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. Cynthia Eisenhower is like the expert at UMaine on all things reuse. She's been working on a lot of pilot communities to try to get them on board to have reuse systems in their local businesses. It's gaining some interest, and they've kind of provided their technical expertise on how that can be implemented. They're looking at primarily coastal communities, because we talk about plastic pollution as like something that's really heart-centric to motivations to reduce waste. And so they're working along the coast to kind of prevent waste at the source. But then there's another coalition of folks working on reuse called Reuse Portland, and it's Greater Portland area, but it includes businesses like Luke's Lobster, Sarah Coffee, which is in Monument Square in Portland, Allagash Brewing, Maine Beer Company are part of this coalition, Tandem Coffee, Eco Maine, Clink. There are lots of different partners, both nonprofit and for-profit sector, that are looking at, piloting reuse in their industry. And we're looking at like closed venues for a potential opportunity for reuse, like concert venues, stadiums, places where a lot of people congregate and they're in one place for a long period of time and stuff doesn't really have to leave the building. So they're looking at piloting things like that. So reuse it's coming. There is a need for infrastructure. So washing facilities for something at this scale is necessary. And we're looking at funding opportunities for that. So EPA is something we're considering, looking at large grant funding to kickstart this program, but there's lots of internal opportunities for funding as well. So those are the ones I'm thinking of, but I'm also thinking about the Materials Management Task Force within the Maine Climate Council. And I bet you there's going to be some recommendations in there about reuse that end up in the Climate Action Plan for the state of Maine, which should be published in December of 24. So we're going to see that soon, but those policy recommendations are underway right now. And I think reuse is going to be a big part of that. So those are what I got so far, but happy to talk more about it with anybody who wants to talk trash.
Great. Now we have a question for Jack that comes with Christine, asking about the port spill, I'm assuming. She asked, have the adjacent communities that will be most impacted been surveyed or asked how they view potential port construction and exemptions of dune protection?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks for the question, Christine. I think there's a couple things I would share there. So starting in 2022, the Department of Transportation convened Offshore Winds Ports Advisory Group as a sort of stakeholder group that included a number of folks that represent local organizations and live in the community. It was co-chaired by the Searsport town manager, and included a number of local folks. That group met probably half a dozen times over the course of about a year, sort of going over all of the different options and pros and cons of the two sites. And that group wasn't a decision-making body; it was an advisory group, so they didn't sort of like vote on a site. But that was some of the information that was taken into account as the DOT and the administration made their siting recommendation. The Searsport Select Board has a couple of times sort of adopted resolutions in support of a port, mostly around the jobs and economic benefits of the port. Both of those have been, haven't been site specific, but really that they support either site, whichever one is moving forward. Senator Curry, who represents Searsport, is a strong supporter of the port and siting the port on Sears Island. Reagan Paul, who represents Searsport in the House, is a vociferous opponent, but is also a vociferous opponent of pretty much everything related to clean energy and climate action. So it's not clear whether opposing the port is sort of a part of a broader sense from her about what ought to happen on energy. She's a noted supporter of nuclear power, for example, which is not likely to be an important part of Maine's efforts to address climate change. We went along with a number of our partners, had an event in Searsport, sort of a public event in January, and the conversation was really mixed. There were some people there who are really opposed to siting the project on Sears Island, felt really passionately. There were also a number of people who really want to see climate action happen and sort of are open to siting the port in either place. I will say, this is our position. Building a port is essential. The most important thing is that we have a port that fulfills the criteria and can actually support the build out of offshore wind at the sort of scale and speed that we need to address climate change. There are some reservations that folks have, and we had a number of conversations with folks with expertise in ports and in the industry about whether Mac Point would work in the end. And that's why I think we thought the bill was so important. It sort of keeps both options on the table. Without the bill, we would only have one option, and if that didn't work, we would really be stuck. And so that was one of the reasons why that was so important. One of our partner groups, the Maine Labor Climate Council, they're a group. They're a group of unions that has been working on climate and clean energy issues. They have two organizers working in Searsport, and they've been doing a lot of canvassing door to door on the ground, helping to answer people's questions and talk about the benefits of a port there. And they've found a lot of folks really excited about the economic opportunities. They have union members who have to drive down to either southern Maine or even down to Massachusetts for work. And so having this economic hub in that region, which lost the Bucksport Mill not too long ago, and otherwise has not that many options for sort of working people, will be really important for sort of the long-term economic health and making sure that they have a economic foundation that's not just based on seasonal folks or tourism, and has sort of that strong foundation. So that's what I can say there. But there hasn't been like an official survey, that's sort of scientific about this issue. And we've found there's actually just a lot of education that still needs to happen. As we talk to people, some people sort of assume that the turbines are going to be built and sort of placed on Sears Island, which is not the case. And so there's a lot of learning, I think, that is needed for folks to make an informed decision about all this.
Great, thanks, Jack. I want to squeeze in one last question on the Trails Bond before we go. So obviously the Trails Bond is a huge step forward for funding trail projects, but I'm curious if there's interest in exploring more of a sustainable funding model that would be more long-term, or what other funding mechanisms might be in mind for the future.
Absolutely. So we have been underinvesting in trails and outdoor recreation infrastructure forever. And we're hoping that the Trails Bond is a turning point where there's this fall, a statewide conversation of all the voters in Maine, developing a deeper understanding of the value of trails to their communities and the importance of investing in trails as our off-road infrastructure, that also generates jobs and economic activity, as Steve mentioned, and lots of other benefits that are a really good return on investment. Our hope is that during the 4 years, $7.5 million per year through this competitive grant program, over 4 years, that we develop a long-term permanent funding approach to maybe a broad concept of trails, outdoor infrastructure, including conservation easements and land conservation, that would be part of the annual budget, so that we would not need to go back every 4 years for a new bond, because we do need to treat these type of investments as critical for the future of our economy. It's an important and growing component of our economy. And there's just going to be a growing level of interest in coming to Maine, using our trails. And we as NRCM strongly believe that it's a big state. There's room for all types of trail users. And we think that with careful planning, this could be an emerging critical part of the future economic viability of the state.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pete. We are past 1 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap up here. I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us, especially Kate and Steve for taking time out of your day to join us as guests. And then thank everyone who tuned in. As Pete said, we will be back next fall for more legislative fun, but we'll also be working to pass the Trails Bond on the ballots all throughout the summer and into November. So would love to have you all join us on that work as well. Thanks and have a great day.